My name is Ethan, and until about 5 months ago, I was just your average, underpaid, perpetually tired guy slogging through an entry-level job in digital marketing. My big dream? Buying a house. A real house. Not a cramped city apartment where I could hear my neighbor cough that I'd been scraping by, saving every dime, when I stumbled onto it, a property listing that seemed too good to be true. And trust me, I knew the real estate market. A 4-bedroom, 2-story house with a massive yard, fully finished basement, and a sprawling front porch, all nestled in the quiet, scenic town of Blackwood Creek. The price? Absurdly low. Like, half of what it should have been. The listing agent, a dry, monotone woman named Mrs. Harlow, barely even tried to sell it. When I called, she just read the bare minimum, 124, Hemlock Lane. Good bones. Cash offer only. No interior photos. Sold as is and where is. No interior photos. Mrs. Harlow, what's wrong with it? I asked, trying to sound casual while my heart hammered with hopeful panic. Her reply was a low, rattling sigh that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. The previous owner, a peculiar man, passed away recently. The family just wants it gone. It's messy. You'll need to sign a waiver regarding any potential contents. Contents? Yes. Personal property. They don't want to clean it out. It smelled like a massive headache and an even bigger opportunity. A diamond in the rough. I drove the 2 hours out to Blackwood Creek that weekend, pulling up to 124 Hemlock Lane. The house itself was beautiful, if intensely isolated. Set back from the road behind a curtain of towering, ancient pine trees, it was painted a deep, faded indigo that seemed to absorb the light. The yard was overgrown, a tangle of wild roses and weeds, and the air here was different, thick, cold, and utterly silent. That I met Mrs. Harlow at the curb. She wore sunglasses indoors, dark even though the sky was overcast. She handed me a key. Look around. Take your time. I'll wait in the car. Just sign the document first. The document was a single sheet of paper with a very unusual clause typed in bold red. The buyer agrees to accept the structure and its inherent contents without inspection or demand for removal. Any unexpected findings, physical or otherwise, are the sole responsibility of the buyer. That I hesitated, the phrasing, physical or otherwise, sending a small, cold shiver down my spine. But the price tag was screaming a different tune. I signed. The moment I unlocked the front door, I was hit by an odor that wasn't just dust or mildew. It was the smell of something deep, metallic, and utterly still, like a forgotten butcher shop next to a library. The living room was dark. All the curtains were drawn, and the furniture was draped in white sheets, giving the room a ghostly, frozen appearance. But it was the hallway that held my attention. The previous owner hadn't just left things behind, he had sealed things. Every single door in the hallway, 7 of them, leading to what I assumed were bedrooms, closets, and the basement, was not only locked but nailed shut with thick, rusty iron spikes. And on the door directly at the end of the hall, the one leading to the master bedroom, there wasn't just a lock and nails. There was a single, pristine white envelope tacked to the center, written in elegant, looping script. That I pulled the envelope off, my fingers trembling slightly. It was addressed simply to the next occupant. That I tore it open. Inside, on heavy parchment, was a single handwritten line: you can open them all. Just start with the one you don't hear breathing. I stood in the profound silence of the house, the key heavy in my hand, staring at 7 spiked doors and a cryptic, chilling note from a dead man. The low price, the vague warning, the absolute isolation. Suddenly, the house didn't feel like a good deal anymore. It felt like a trap that I could still back out. I could walk away, tell Mrs. Harlow I changed my mind, but I'd signed the paper. And the mystery, that terrible, seductive hook of the unknown, was already lodged deep in my mind. What was behind those doors? And which one was breathing? I walked back down the hall and pressed my ear to the nearest sealed door. Silence. Utter, complete silence. The choice, I realized, wasn't whether to open them. It was which terrifying secret to uncover first. The phrase echoed in my mind, mocking the stillness of the house: just start with the one you don't hear breathing. I moved down the line of 7 spiked doors, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The air in the hallway felt heavy, like it was resisting my every movement. The first 3 doors yielded nothing. I pressed my ear flush against the cold wood, nothing but the faint internal rush of blood in my own ears. The 4th door was different. As I leaned in, I heard it. Not a breath, exactly, but a low, soft hiss. It was cyclical, rhythmic, like a pressure release valve on a distant machine, but muted. Hiss, pause. Hiss, pause. It was faint enough that I almost dismissed it as a draft, but the pattern was too precise that I backed away quickly, moving to the 5th door. Silence. The 6th door, the large one I suspected led to the basement stairs, offered a deep, resonant thud. It was a single, heavy noise, followed by a slight dragging sound, then complete silence. I couldn't be sure if it was inside the room or just the house settling, but it was enough to make me step back. Finally, the 7th door, the one at the very end of the hall, the master bedroom, was silent. Absolutely, profoundly silent. The kind of silence that doesn't exist in a normal house, the kind of silence that feels engineered, pressed into the space like a physical substance. You can open them all. Just start with the one you don't hear breathing. I returned to the 7th door. The master bedroom. The previous owner, the peculiar man, had chosen this room to leave his final, chilling instruction. I looked at the heavy iron spikes holding the door firmly shut. They were old and driven deep into the frame. That I went back to my car and retrieved the toolbox I always kept for emergencies. I took out a heavy claw hammer and a sturdy pry bar. Working on the nails was loud. Each metallic screech as the claw pulled a nail free felt deafening in the dead quiet of the house. I kept glancing down the hall, half expecting one of the other doors to creak open or for the soft hiss to suddenly get louder. It took 15 grueling minutes to pull out all the spikes. The last one came free with a final, protesting groan of wood. The door remained closed, held fast by the original knob lock that I fumbled with the ring of keys Mrs. Harlow had given me. One of them, a heavy, tarnished skeleton key, fit perfectly into the lock. I turned it, and the tumbler clicked with a definitive, almost celebratory sound. That I stood there for a long moment, sweat stinging my eyes, the door still closed. I hadn't prepared for the sheer terror of actually opening it. Just do it, Ethan. It's an empty room. Just a messy, dusty, empty room. That I pushed the door open, slowly, bracing for some theatrical jump scare or sudden noise, but there was nothing. The room was vast, easily the size of my entire city apartment. And it wasn't messy. It was meticulous. Spotlessly clean, but sterile. The furniture was minimal, a massive, antique 4-poster bed dominating the center, a mahogany dresser, and a single, high-backed leather armchair positioned in the corner. The windows were covered not by curtains, but by thick, black wooden shutters, sealed tight with metal latches. The room was illuminated only by the thin wedge of light spilling in from the hallway that I walked in, my shoes echoing on the bare wooden floor. The temperature in here was noticeably colder than the hallway that I approached the dresser. Everything was empty. That I moved to the large bed. It was neatly made up with pristine white linen, stark against the dark wood. There were no indentations, no dust. It looked like the bed in a high-end furniture showroom, but as I leaned over the bed, I noticed something carved into the headboard. A single, small, perfectly incised symbol. It wasn't a letter or a number. It was a spiral, 3 rotations, starting small and widening out, with a tiny horizontal line bisecting the very center. It was unsettlingly precise. That I circled the bed, peering into the shadows cast by the large posts, until I reached the corner where the leather armchair sat. That it was facing the wall, its back towards me. "Hello," I whispered, the sound immediately swallowed by the room. That I reached out and spun the chair around. The chair was empty. But sitting perfectly centered on the seat cushion was a small, antique music box. It was crafted from dark oak, smooth and polished. As I picked it up, it was heavier than it looked. I ran my thumb over the brass clasp, noting that it was unlocked. Before I could open it, a faint, metallic clink reached my ears. It came from the back of the room, behind the heavy wooden shutters. That I dropped the music box back onto the chair with a small, startled thump. The sound came again. Clink. Clink. That it was coming from outside the window. The windows, sealed by those thick, metal-latched shutters. That I approached the window cautiously, placing my ear near the shutter. The clink was closer now, accompanied by a subtle, soft scraping sound, like metal dragging against wood, and then, very clearly, a soft, dry whisper slipped through the minuscule gap where the shutters met the window frame. It didn't say my name, but the message was instantly, chillingly personal. You started on the wrong side, Ethan. The spiral goes in, not out. I froze, terror overriding every rational thought. How did he know my name? The previous owner was dead. No one knew I was here except Mrs. Harlow, waiting outside. And the whispered voice was definitely not hers. That I bolted for the door, scrambling into the hallway, leaving the light on and the door wide open. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the stairs, staring wide-eyed at the next sealed door. The one with the faint, rhythmic hiss. That I knew I shouldn't go back in there. I knew I should run. But now I knew two things: I was being watched, and the occupant's game, had just begun. The whispered voice from behind the sealed shutters, "You started on the wrong side, Ethan," replayed in my head, a cold, sharp echo. It confirmed my worst fear. This wasn't just a dilapidated house, it was an elaborate, terrifying mechanism designed by its deceased owner, and I had just turned the first gear. That I retreated from the master bedroom's open doorway, shutting the heavy door and locking it again, though I knew the gesture was pointless. The threat wasn't in the room, it was aware of my presence. That I leaned against the opposite wall, struggling to steady my breathing. The music box. The spiral symbol. The cryptic message. I needed to focus. The man who owned this house had left a very deliberate path. My focus shifted back to the remaining 6 doors. The 6th door, the one that had held the deep thud and dragging sound, still felt too volatile. The 4th door, however, with its steady, faint hiss, now felt like the logical next step. It wasn't breathing, exactly, but it was a distinct, cyclical sound. Maybe that was the former owner's cruel definition of not breathing. I approached the 4th door again. The spikes looked just as formidable, but now I had a new, driving force, the need to understand. That I spent another 20 minutes prying the spikes free. This time, I didn't rush. I paused after every nail, listening. The hiss never stopped, never wavered. It was persistent, mechanical, and completely indifferent to the noise I was making. Finally, the door was free. I turned the skeleton key in the lock, and the mechanism fell away. That I pulled the door open, ready for anything, a tripwire, an explosion of dust, or something far worse. The room was a small, windowless closet, roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. It was completely empty, save for a single item positioned in the exact center of the floor, a tarnished brass humidifier, the kind people use for cigars or storing sensitive documents. It was plugged into a low-lying, dusty outlet. A thin stream of vapor, almost invisible in the gloom, was escaping from a vent in the top. The rhythmic, cyclical sound I had heard was the unit automatically regulating its internal humidity, drawing water from a small, clear reservoir inside. The former owner had engineered the sound to trick me. That I knelt down and unplugged the unit. The hiss stopped instantly. Complete silence. That I stared at the humidifier, wondering what the purpose was. Why draw attention to an empty closet? I opened the lid of the brass box. Inside, resting on a bed of dry cotton, was not a document, but a single, unusual key. It wasn't a house key, it was a small, ornate key, made of dark, almost black metal, with an intricate, circular head. Around the circle, tiny characters were engraved, symbols I didn't recognize, archaic and slightly disturbing. Beneath the key was another folded piece of heavy parchment. That I unfolded the note. The script was the same elegant hand as the first. The spiral unwinds. You followed the breath, and now you have the means to stop it. This key opens what is not meant to be found. But the mechanism demands a trade. A trade. The note continued, "You have something of mine. Something that plays. Bring it here. Lock it in. Then you may proceed." The music box. The antique music box I had left sitting on the leather armchair in the master bedroom. A cold dread settled over me. He knew exactly what I had found. He was dictating my movements. The note also confirmed that the master bedroom, the silent room, was the first step. By leaving the silence of that room for the sound of the fourth, I had taken the right action based on his chilling instructions, even if I was terrified by the knowledge that I was being watched. That I looked at the brass box. It was the trade location. It was also a perfect fit for the music box. That I clutched the dark, strange key in my palm. The mechanism to stop the breath felt less like an unlock and more like a deeper plunge into whatever psychological horror the previous owner had created. That I had to go back to the master bedroom. Back to the sealed windows and the whispered message. This was the moment I should have called the police. This was the moment I should have left the house and never looked back. But the adrenaline, the strange key, and the compelling, intellectual horror of the game, it was too much. I had to know what the key was for. That I locked the fourth door and hurried back to the master bedroom, the key to stop the breath, heavy and cold in my hand, bracing myself for another whisper from the darkness. I slipped back into the master bedroom. The air felt even colder, and the sliver of light from the hallway barely pushed back the gloom. The room was exactly as I had left it, the spine-straight bed, the shadowed corners, and the armchair with the antique music box resting on its seat. That I held my breath, listening for the whisper, for the sound of the clink on the shutters. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. It was almost worse than the noise. That I snatched the music box from the chair. It felt heavier than before, almost resisting my grip. I paused, examining the bottom of the box for any hidden latch or clue, but found nothing. Just the polished oak and a slight, acrid smell, like burnt ozone. With the music box secured, I hurried back to the fourth door, the humidifier closet. I unlocked it, went inside, and placed the music box gently into the brass humidifier unit. It fit perfectly, snug against the cotton lining. That I closed the brass lid. Click. That I stared at the sealed box, feeling a strange mix of relief and profound unease. I had completed the trade. That I pulled out the unusual, dark metal key I had found under the music box. Now what? The note had said, "This key opens what is not meant to be found." But the mechanism demands a trade. Where was the lock? I scanned the small closet. There were no other doors, no vents, no panels. Just the bare wooden walls, the dusty outlet where the humidifier had been plugged in, and the floor. That I looked down. The wooden planks of the floor were old and wide. I knelt and ran my hands over the surface, checking for any seams or handles. Nothing. Then I noticed it. Near the center, a knot in the wood was slightly larger, slightly darker than the others. I pressed on it. It didn't budge. That I took the ornate key and gently inserted the circular head into the knot. It slipped in easily, fitting with a soft, satisfying shhk. That I turned the key one full rotation. Instead of a latch clicking, the entire floor of the small closet gave way with a low, metallic groan. A square section, about 2 feet across, recessed into the floor like a small, unexpected elevator descending into darkness. A rush of cold, damp air flooded the closet, carrying with it a powerful scent of iron and decay, the same metallic smell I had first noticed upon entering the house, amplified tenfold. That I peered down into the opening. It was a narrow, vertical shaft leading into complete blackness. I couldn't see the bottom. This was the spiral unwinding. This was what is not meant to be found. I considered abandoning the house for the 10th time. But the cold thrill of discovery, the intellectual engagement with this dead man's horrifying game, held me fast. That I went back to the master bedroom, retrieved the heavy-duty flashlight from my toolbox, and returned to the shaft. That I shined the beam down. It cut through the darkness, illuminating a rickety ladder made of cast iron, descending maybe 15 or 20 feet to a floor made of packed earth. Just before stepping onto the ladder, I retrieved the small piece of parchment I had used to wrap the first key. I needed to ensure I hadn't missed anything. I held the flashlight close to the elegant, looping script that I noticed a slight bleed through of ink on the back of the note, something I hadn't seen before. I flipped the paper over. In fainter, more hurried handwriting, almost scrawled, was a list of 5 names, each one crossed out with a heavy, single line: Elias, Victoria, Harold, Josephine, Ethan, my name. The 5th name on a crossed-out list, the breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a game for the next occupant. This was a list of victims. Or perhaps, a list of predecessors that I gripped the ladder's cold rungs, the chill radiating up my arms. The whispered voice was right. I hadn't just bought a house. I had inherited a role that I began my descent into the suffocating darkness of the pit, leaving the trade and the crossed-out list behind. The shaft was so narrow I could feel the cold, damp earth pressing in on either side. As my feet hit the dirt floor, I brought the flashlight up, scanning the space. That I wasn't in a basement. I was in a small, circular, man-made bunker. The air was heavy, and the silence was absolute. My light beam fell upon the only other thing in the room, a heavy, black safe, secured to the wall with massive steel bolts. It was an antique, industrial-grade vault, and etched into the vault door, deeply and crudely, was that same unsettling symbol, the spiral, 3 rotations, bisected by a single line. This, I realized, was the key's target. The final secret in this section of the house. That I looked closer at the safe. It didn't have a dial combination. Instead, it had a single, heavy keyhole, the exact shape of the dark, ornate key I held. That I inserted the key. It turned with a low, hydraulic schlick. That I pulled the heavy door open. It swung out, grinding slightly against the dirt floor, revealing the interior of the safe. That it wasn't filled with money or jewels. It was a dense stack of small, perfectly bound notebooks. Hundreds of them, all identically covered in dark, plain leather. That I reached in and pulled the top one out. The cover was blank. I opened it. The first page was filled with that elegant, looping handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a catalog. The very first entry read, "Case file, the architect's first failure. Subject, Elias. Discarded in the crawlspace, under the 3rd stair riser." The hiss was necessary too. I couldn't finish the sentence. My flashlight beam wavered, and a terrible, wet sound echoed from somewhere above me, originating from the floorboards of the house I had just left. It wasn't the hiss. It was a soft, guttural, choked breathing, and it was coming from the door I had left open above me. The breathing, wet, labored, and terribly close, snapped me out of my trance. I was holding a catalog of murder victims, trapped 20 feet below the floorboards in a bunker, and something was now hovering over the open shaft. That I killed the flashlight, plunging the bunker into absolute darkness. The breathing sound above immediately shifted. It stopped its rhythmic cadence and began to sniff, a wet, deliberate sound, like an animal searching for a scent. Then, I heard a faint, scraping sound, the metal grating of the ladder being tested by something heavy. That I pressed myself against the cold, damp earth wall next to the open safe, holding the small leather notebook tight. My heart was a frantic, useless drum in my chest. That it knows I'm here. It's coming down. That I waited, listening to the agonizingly slow descent. The iron rungs creaked ominously. Whatever was up there was heavy, and it wasn't moving with human grace. As the creature, or person, reached the halfway point, a thick, putrid odor began to seep into the bunker. It was the powerful smell of stagnant water, decay, and unwashed linen, a smell that turned my stomach. That I knew I couldn't stay here. If it reached the bottom, I was trapped between it and the bolted safe. Using the small distraction of the squeaking ladder, I silently slipped past the safe and moved to the far end of the circular bunker. My fingers brushed against a cold, smooth surface, a large metal plate set flush into the packed earth wall. That I frantically searched the plate with my fingers. Near the bottom, there was a small handle, designed to be pulled rather than turned. As I did, the sound of the breathing thing was almost at the bottom of the shaft. I could hear a thick, dragging noise, as if it had a limb that wasn't working correctly. That I yanked the handle. The plate swung inward silently, revealing a narrow, dark crawlspace barely large enough for me to squeeze through. That I threw myself into the hole, pulling the heavy metal plate shut just as the wet, guttural gasp echoed from the main chamber of the bunker. That I was now in complete, suffocating darkness. The small space smelled of old, dry dust and a strange, sweet spice, like cinnamon mixed with arsenic that I listened. Outside the plate, I heard the thing shuffling. It was bumping against the safe, sniffing the dirt floor. Then, a low, thick, scraping sound against the metal plate I was hiding behind, clink. Clink. Clink that it was tapping the plate with something metallic. It knew I was in here that I waited, motionless, for what felt like an hour. The scraping stopped. The sniffing stopped. The heavy breathing remained, but it seemed to have settled, waiting for me to make a move that I slowly, carefully, pulled out the notebook and turned the flashlight on, cupping the beam with my hand to create the absolute minimum light necessary to read that I had to understand what I was dealing with. This was the only weapon I had that I flipped to a random page and began reading the elegant handwriting, case file, the architect's second success. Subject, Victoria. She was too loud. The volume of the hiss must be maintained at a consistent 15 dB, no more. Her placement in the ventilation system ensures compliance. Trade made, the clockwork bird. The clockwork bird. The music box. The trade I had just made. The thing I locked inside the humidifier closet that I flipped back to the first page, the architect's first failure. Subject, Elias. Discarded in the crawlspace, under the third stair riser. The hiss was necessary to, I finally saw the end of the sentence, to mask the scraping. I was in a crawlspace. Was this the crawlspace? I looked around my cramped confines. The flashlight beam revealed rough, unfinished earth walls and low-hanging support beams. I began to crawl forward, clutching the notebook. After only a few feet, I noticed something small and white sticking out of the dirt near a support beam. I reached out and pulled it free. That it was a small, desiccated bone. Not human, I told myself desperately. Maybe a rabbit. Then I saw the wood. A section of the ceiling above me, the floorboards of the house, was newer than the rest. And directly underneath it was a small, dark depression in the dirt that I reached up and pressed against the new wood. It was loose. I pushed harder, and a section of the subfloor lifted, revealing the dusty, dark space beneath the main stairs, the third riser. The bone I held felt suddenly very heavy. That I looked into the cavity. The air here was drier, cleaner. And resting on a bed of shredded newspaper was a small, dusty child's shoe. The leather cracked and old. Next to the shoe, placed neatly, was another piece of the familiar, heavy parchment. That I pulled the note out. It was addressed again to, the next occupant. The spiral demands progress, not retreat. You understand the history, but you ignore the mechanism. The architect's true catalog is kept in the place of the failed trade. The other doors are simply distractions to maintain the atmosphere. And the breathing? It waits for the clockwork bird to sing. I looked down at the bone and the shoe. The architect's failure. Then I remembered the music box, the trade. I had locked it away, but I hadn't opened it. The note said the breathing waits for the clockwork bird to sing. The thing outside my hiding place had stopped scraping. It was just breathing, heavy and slow. That I realized with a jolt of horror that by securing the music box, I had set a timer. That I had to get back to the fourth door and stop the song, or whatever monstrosity was waiting outside was going to come looking for the source of the music. But first, I needed the catalog. The true catalog. The one in the place of the failed trade. That I looked at the black vault behind the metal plate. I had a choice, risk going back to the vault for the information, or risk going back to the fourth door to stop the timer. The rasping, waiting breath outside the door made the decision for me. I had to stop the song. That I silently pulled myself back out of the crawlspace and pressed my ear against the metal plate. The breathing was right there, heavy and expectant. That I had to wait for it to move. I was trapped. Pressed against the damp earth wall, separated from the breathing entity by a single, thin metal plate. The stench of decay was nauseatingly strong. I clutched the grim notebook, the catalog of failure, feeling the rough texture of its leather cover. The creature's breathing continued, slow, deep, and patient. It sounded like an animal settling in for a long wait. I realized it wasn't waiting for me to move, it was waiting for the music box to start playing. The realization forced me to move. I couldn't risk the sound of the clockwork bird starting while I was down here. That I pulled out a small, flat piece of metal from my toolbox, a thin spatula I'd originally used for patching drywall, and used it to carefully probe the small gap where the metal plate met the bunker wall. That I could see nothing, but I could hear a faint, low-pitched drip, drip, sound coming from the main bunker chamber. Whatever was in there was shedding liquid. That I needed a distraction. That I used the spatula to scrape a handful of loose dirt and small stones from the floor and threw them, hard, against the bunker wall, as far away from the hatch as I could manage. Clatter. The noise was loud and sharp in the confined space. The breathing thing reacted instantly. It let out a low, wet growl, and the sound of heavy shuffling moved rapidly across the dirt floor towards the sound. The momentary diversion was enough. That I yanked the small handle on the metal plate and burst out of the crawlspace, not bothering to close the plate behind me. I scrambled past the black safe and leapt onto the iron ladder, ascending 2 rungs at a time. That I was halfway up when the shuffling thing turned. It let out a sound that wasn't a growl or a breath, but a choked, rasping sigh, the sound of immense, terrible disappointment. That I looked down. In the fleeting glow of my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of it, a hulking, hunched-over silhouette. It wasn't just heavy, it was misshapen. One arm looked disproportionately long, ending in what appeared to be a huge, claw-like hand that scraped uselessly at the ladder rungs. The other side of its body was indistinct, obscured by shadows. But the eyes, 2 small, glistening points reflecting my light, were fixed on me with malignant focus. That I reached the top of the shaft, grabbed the edge of the floorboards, and pulled myself out. I threw the square panel back over the hole, letting it fall with a deafening thud. I didn't bother with the key. The sound from below was immediate, a terrible, raw scream of frustration, followed by the violent, heavy thump of the creature slamming against the underside of the panel. The entire floor of the closet shook. That I stumbled out of the 4th door, locking it hastily. I had maybe a minute before it found a way through or around the temporary seal. My mind raced. The music box. The clockwork bird. I had to get it out. That I raced back to the humidifier closet, the 4th door, fumbling with the skeleton key. I unlocked it, threw the door open, and darted inside. The brass humidifier box, containing the music box, was sitting exactly where I left it, and it was playing. It was a delicate, tinny melody, a simple, childish tune, but in the silence of the house, it was an announcement, a siren. It was the song that the breathing thing had been waiting for. I snatched the humidifier box, threw the lid open, and grabbed the music box. I was about to slam it against the wall to silence it, when I noticed something inside the brass box that hadn't been there before. The cotton lining, which had been dry, was now soaked with a dark, oily liquid. And etched into the lid of the music box itself was a second spiral symbol, identical to the first, but this one was moving. No, not moving. The light was making it look like it was moving. But as I watched, the small metal prongs inside the music box mechanism, the ones that strike the tines to create the sound, began to slow. The tune stretched and warped, becoming slower, lower-pitched, and distorted, like a human voice winding down into a demonic drone. The music box was slowing down, but it wouldn't stop. Suddenly, a heavy crack split the air. The sound came from the 3rd door down the hall, the one I had checked for breathing and found silent. It wasn't silence anymore. It was a single, violent impact. I looked down the hall. A large, jagged split had appeared in the center of the 3rd door. Something heavy and powerful had struck it from the inside. He said the other doors were distractions. But they were becoming active. The mechanism was accelerating. I realized I couldn't stop the music box. I had to contain it. The note about the trade flashed back to me. You have something of mine. Something that plays. Bring it here. Lock it in. Then you may proceed. The trade wasn't a one-time event, it was a containment strategy. I ran out of the closet and looked at the remaining doors. The 3rd door was clearly compromised. The 5th door was silent. The 2nd door was silent. I needed the place of containment, the master bedroom, the first, silent room. The place where I started. The room that now held the secret of the spiral that I raced down the hall, holding the still singing music box, which was now playing a deeply disturbing, slow-motion lullaby that I threw open the master bedroom door and looked back down the hall. The crack in the third door was widening, and a faint, thin finger of red fluid was oozing out onto the floor that I slammed the master bedroom door shut, locked it, and scanned the room frantically. Where was the containment? The mechanism? I looked at the furniture, the dresser, the bed, the armchair. I scanned the floor again, then I looked at the only other structure in the room, the large, thick wooden shutters over the windows that I ran to the shutters. They were secured by two thick metal latches that I fought the latches free, the metal groaning as I disengaged them. I pulled the shutters open. Instead of a window pane, there was a second, inner set of doors, reinforced with heavy steel. And set into the center of the steel was a small, circular opening, a hatch just large enough to fit the music box, containment that I quickly jammed the still singing music box into the circular opening. It fit perfectly, stopping the sound instantly as it sealed the hole. Silence returned to the room, but it was heavy, vibrating with tension. As soon as the music box was sealed, a quiet, insistent tapping began on the other side of the steel door that I backed away, terrified, staring at the small, antique box I had trapped in the wall. The tapping grew louder, more rhythmic, and then, a new voice, a voice that was clear, low, and utterly calm, spoke from the other side of the inner door, its sound completely unmuffled by the steel. "The architect needs his catalog back, Ethan. Go down." Before the distractions reached the surface, I looked back at the hallway door. The sound of something large and wet scraping against the floor had returned. That I knew exactly what I had to do. The safe in the bunker. I had to face the monster below to retrieve the true catalog. The calm, articulate voice from behind the steel window doors, the voice that knew my name and demanded the catalog, was infinitely more terrifying than the wet, rasping sighs from the hallway. The tapping on the music box grew more frantic, vibrating through the steel door. Whatever was outside wanted the music to continue. I knew the voice was right. I couldn't stay up here. The entire house was a ticking machine, and the distractions, the things behind the other doors, were now active. I ran out of the master bedroom, locking the door firmly behind me. The hallway was darker now, the air thick with tension. I looked at the third door. The red fluid had now formed a small, dark puddle on the floor. It was thick, viscous, and smelled intensely of ozone and copper. I had to move fast. I raced to the fourth door, unlocked it, and threw myself into the small humidifier closet, quickly closing and locking the door again. The square panel covering the shaft was still sealed, but the creature below was still active. Every few seconds, the panel would rattle violently as the thing slammed against it, trying to dislodge the wooden stopper. I gripped the key I had used to open the safe. I had to face the monster below to get the notebooks. I unlocked the square panel, pulled it open, and looked down the shaft. The heavy breathing was still there, right at the bottom, but the immediate violence had subsided. It was waiting, listening. I carefully lowered myself onto the iron ladder. This time, I moved with professional silence, keeping my weight centered and avoiding any metallic squeak. As my feet approached the bottom, I paused, listening intently. The thing was near the safe, just feet away from the opening to the crawlspace I had used. I could hear its wet, heavy breathing, and a disgusting, sucking noise, as if it were consuming something on the dirt floor. I slipped off the last rung, landing softly on the earth. I still held the small, first notebook, the catalog of failure, in my left hand. I flipped the flashlight on, keeping the beam focused low, a mere cone of light on the ground. The creature was huge. It was hunched over, its back a mass of strange, bony protrusions that looked like badly set joints. It was covered in dark, matted hair that trailed down to the floor. Its legs were thick and bowed, its head was turned away from me, and it was focused intently on the safe. It was running that long, claw-like hand over the steel door, a slow, mesmerizing stroke. I used the safe as cover and began to shuffle sideways towards the metal plate that concealed the crawlspace entrance. Suddenly, the creature made a low, rattling sound, a sound of confusion. It stopped fondling the safe and turned its head, slowly, towards the sound I had made. The light beam caught its face. It wasn't a mask or a monster. It was a man, grossly distorted, His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull. But it was his eyes. They were large, bulging, and completely white, like eggs. He was blind that he was navigating by sound and scent that he turned his body fully towards me and took a single, shuffling, heavy step. He let out a low, guttural grunt that seemed to be asking a question that I needed the catalog, but I needed to live more that I desperately looked for anything to distract him. My eyes fell on the notebook I was holding, the catalog of failure. The one the architect had dismissed. That I took a deep breath, drew my arm back, and threw the notebook as hard as I could into the opposite wall of the bunker. Slap. The sound echoed violently. The blind, hulking creature reacted instantly. It let out a triumphant roar, the sound of success, and lumbered towards the noise, believing it had found me. This was my chance. I bolted to the safe, shoved the ornate key into the lock, and yanked the heavy door open. The vault was filled with hundreds of identical, leather-bound notebooks. I didn't have time to sort through them. That I grabbed the first stack I could find, about 50 of them, and pulled them free, shoving them into the oversized pockets of my jeans and jacket. The weight was instantly overwhelming. The architect's true catalog, the voice had said that I turned to escape, but the blind creature had stopped at the wall, sniffing at the fallen notebook. It had realized its mistake. That it let out a chilling, drawn-out scream, a sound that spoke of betrayal and furious disappointment. It turned and lunged at the sound of the opening safe door. That I scrambled back onto the ladder, ascending as fast as my suddenly heavy body would allow. I didn't look down. That I hauled myself out of the shaft and slammed the wooden panel back down. I secured it with a makeshift lock. My heavy claw hammer jammed into a crack in the floor, pinning the panel tight. That I stumbled out of the fourth door, the 50 notebooks heavy on my person, breathing hard. That I looked down the hall at the third door. The crack was wider now. The red fluid was a definite, spreading puddle, and I could now hear a distinct, scraping sound from inside the third room. It wasn't the heavy thud of the monster below. This was lighter, faster, more methodical. That I had the catalog. Now I needed to find out what to do with it. The first clue had been in the master bedroom. That I went back to the master bedroom, unlocked the door, and slipped inside, closing it gently. The tapping on the music box had stopped. Instead, the clear, calm voice was back, now quieter, sounding almost pleased. "You chose the books over the distraction, Ethan. Good. Now, look at the wall behind the bed. The catalog will reveal the locks." I turned my flashlight towards the massive four-poster bed. I moved around to the wall behind the headboard, the weight of the notebooks dragging me down. The wall was covered in antique wallpaper, but running my hand over it, I felt a seam, a slight protrusion of wood. That I pressed the seam, and a section of the wallpaper split open, revealing a recessed panel the size of a door. It was completely smooth, made of dark, unvarnished oak, and etched deeply into the center of the panel was the final, complex spiral. But this one wasn't a static drawing. It was a mechanism, a series of interlocking rings, each with tiny, obscure symbols on its surface, and beneath the spiral was a single, long slot, perfectly sized for one of the leather-bound notebooks. "The catalog will reveal the locks." That I pulled a single notebook from my jacket pocket, opened it to a random page, and began to read, scanning for patterns. The architect hadn't left me a key. He had left me an instruction manual. I stood before the hidden oak panel, the final, terrifying lock in the master bedroom. The spiral mechanism looked like an ancient, complex astronomical device, with tiny symbols, triangles, circles with interior dots, and abstract lines, etched onto the 3 concentric rings. Below it was the slot designed for the notebook. That I pulled one of the leather-bound notebooks from my pocket and opened it. This was not the dismissive catalog of failure. This was the architect's true record. That I flipped to the first entry and started reading, realizing immediately that the content wasn't about the victims, but about the house itself, a maniacal set of architectural and psychological blueprints. The handwriting, though elegant, was dense with technical jargon and insane calculations. Entry 37. The Atmos lock. The containment unit on the western wall of the master chamber, 124, requires activation sequence derived from the first 3 symbols of the 4th subject's disposition. The sequence is inverted upon retrieval. The symbol for fear, a circle divided by 2, must align with the primary rotation axis. The symbol for isolation, the broken line, must align with the secondary rotation axis. The final alignment must be submission, the inverted triangle. This was the combination. A psychological key tied to symbols that I quickly looked through the notebook, comparing the symbols mentioned to the ones on the mechanism: fear, circle divided by 2, isolation, broken line, submission, inverted triangle, and the crucial instruction: the sequence is inverted upon retrieval. This meant I needed to start with submission and end with fear. That I started to rotate the rings on the lock. The metal moved with a smooth, well-oiled precision that I rotated the outermost ring until the inverted triangle, submission, clicked into place beneath the guide mark. That I rotated the middle ring until the broken line, isolation, snapped into alignment. That I rotated the innermost ring until the circle divided by 2, fear, aligned. Click. Clunk. Thunk. The mechanism locked into place, but the panel did not open. The calm voice, still originating from behind the sealed steel window, spoke up, a note of disappointment in its tone. "You misunderstand the mechanism, Ethan. The book is not the key. The book is the power source. Insert the knowledge to activate the lock." I looked down at the slot. The book. That I shoved the leather-bound notebook into the slot. It slid in with a heavy, sucking sound, disappearing completely into the wall. The entire hidden panel hummed to life. The symbols on the spiral mechanism began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. The panel slid silently inward, revealing not another room, but a large, deep recess built into the wall. Inside, suspended in the space, was an object that made my blood run cold. That it was a large, ornate iron cage, roughly the size of a small refrigerator. And inside the cage was a skeleton. Not just bones, but a complete human skeleton, fixed in a sitting position, its ribcage slightly compressed, wearing what looked like tattered, Victorian-era clothing. This was the architect's true trophy, but the skeleton wasn't the focus. Resting neatly in the skeleton's lap was a polished, small, lacquered wooden box. That I reached in and carefully lifted the box. It was light and felt empty. I set it down on the bed and opened it. Inside, nestled on blue velvet, was a single item, an antique, folding straight razor with a pearl handle. The blade was spotless, gleaming, and wickedly sharp. A new piece of parchment was taped to the underside of the lid. "The tools required for the next phase are now yours. But you are running out of time. The distractions are breaking free, and the final subject is always the hardest to contain. Go to the second door. The key to the final chamber is within. You must sacrifice silence to gain the means to stop the noise. The second door." I hadn't checked the second door since the beginning. That I snatched the straight razor, feeling its cold, dangerous weight. Suddenly, the silence in the master bedroom was shattered. From the hallway, there was a deafening, wet crack, the sound of the third door being completely annihilated. A heavy splat followed, and then a fast, dragging sound, much quicker than the monster in the basement. The distraction was out. That I darted out of the master bedroom, slammed the oak panel shut, and locked the main door behind me. That I looked down the hall. The third door was completely broken, splintered outward. The puddle of red fluid was much larger now, and leading away from the destruction were 2 distinct, thin, oily tracks, scraping quickly along the floorboards toward the main stairwell. Whatever was behind the third door was agile and moving towards the house's main entry point. That I didn't hesitate. I ran towards the second door, the straight razor clutched tight in my hand. That I pried out the spikes in a panic-fueled frenzy. The wood was tearing, the nails shrieking as I yanked them free. Finally, I inserted the skeleton key and threw the second door open. This room was a small study, dimly lit by the bare light filtering in from the hallway. It was orderly and dusty. A single, large wooden desk dominated the room, with a tall, antique glass water cooler next to it, but it was the desk that mattered. It was covered in hundreds of sheets of paper, all covered in the architect's beautiful, terrifying script. And pinned to the center of the desk was a single, silver key, the last skeleton key on my ring. That I reached for the key. As my fingers brushed the cold metal, the glass water cooler next to the desk exploded inward. Crash, a thick, roiling mass of black fluid, darker than oil, lashed out from the broken glass and wrapped itself around my arm, pulling me into the room. The shock of the freezing liquid stole my breath. I instinctively swung the straight razor in my hand. The razor blade sliced through the thick, viscous substance, and it recoiled, shrieking, a high-pitched, feminine wail that cut through the house. That I pulled my arm free, snatching the silver key from the desk. That I looked down at the black fluid. It was flowing rapidly, receding back into the desk, leaving behind scorch marks on the wood. It had the same metallic, ozonic smell as the red liquid from the third door. The sound of the high-pitched wail was enough to trigger movement elsewhere. From the downstairs floor, a new sound began, a furious, rhythmic smashing. Someone, or something, was destroying the downstairs living room. That I bolted out of the second door, locking it behind me, the silver key tight in my fist. I now had all the tools and the final key, the final chamber. The final subject. That I looked at the last remaining sealed door, the fifth one. And I knew exactly where I had to go. The house was in chaos. Downstairs, the frantic smashing continued, echoing the destruction of furniture and glass. The high-pitched wail from the black fluid entity behind the second door still lingered in the air, a raw, painful sound. And from the basement shaft, the heavy thumping was relentless. That I now held the final key, the silver skeleton key. That I turned to the fifth door. It was the only remaining sealed door, silent and innocuous amidst the pandemonium. It was the final chamber. I ripped the spikes out with a desperate speed I didn't know I possessed, the metal shrieking one last time in protest. I jammed the silver key into the lock. It turned perfectly. That I threw the fifth door open, prepared for the worst. The room was not a bedroom, nor a closet, nor a study. It was a sterile, brightly lit space, a small, makeshift hospital room. The light came from a single, bare fluorescent bulb buzzing angrily overhead. The walls were painted white, but stained yellow with age. The floor was bare concrete. That I in the center of the room was a small metal cot, and sitting on the cot, facing the door, was a young woman. She was pale, thin, and dressed in a simple white gown. Her hair was black and brittle, and her eyes were wide, dark, and utterly vacant. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the final subject. "Hello," I whispered, my voice thick with disbelief. This was not a monster, this was a victim. The woman didn't move. She didn't blink. That I stepped cautiously into the room. It was disturbingly quiet compared to the noise raging outside. That I looked around. A small metal medical trolley stood near the cot, holding an empty vial and a single, heavy, ancient leather strap. On the wall directly above the woman's head, the architect had placed his final, most chilling message. It was a painting, not a handwritten note. The painting depicted the house, 124, Hemlock Lane, but with strange, distorted windows. And in the foreground, standing on the lawn, were 5 dark, shadowy figures. The figures were labeled, in elegant script, Elias, Victoria, Harold, Josephine, and Ethan. That I was meant to be the fifth subject, but the final, terrifying detail was painted right above the subject on the cot. It was the symbol of the spiral, and it was labeled, the noise. The noise, I breathed, looking back at the vacant woman. The one I was meant to contain. That I moved closer to the cot. As I did, the woman finally moved. Very slowly, her head turned to follow me, her dark eyes locking onto mine. She raised her hands from her lap, and I saw that she was holding a small, antique bell, the kind used to call a maid or servant. It was made of tarnished silver. She opened her mouth, and a sound came out. It wasn't a scream or a cry for help. It was a terrible, deep, guttural winding noise, like an old clock being forcefully overwound, and as the winding sound filled the air, she began to ring the bell. Ding. 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 The small, silver sound was the catalyst. Immediately, all hell broke loose. The smashing downstairs stopped instantly. The thumping from the basement shaft stopped. The high-pitched wail from the second door died out. Instead, the entire house was filled with a horrific symphony of simultaneous, directed movement. The heavy, lumbering footsteps of the basement monster began to ascend the stairs from downstairs, not the shaft. It had found the main staircase. The fast, scraping sound of the creature from the third door was now rushing down the hallway towards the fifth door, and from behind the second door, a thick, gushing sound indicated the black fluid was leaking out, aiming for the final room. They were all coming for the source of the bell, for the noise. The woman, the final subject, smiled, a slow, vacant, terrifying pull of the lips. She wasn't ringing the bell for help. She was ringing it to summon them all. That I looked at the razor in my hand. You must sacrifice silence to gain the means to stop the noise. The note hadn't meant to use the razor to hurt myself. It meant to use it to stop the woman from creating the noise. I stepped back, horrified. I was not an executioner. I couldn't hurt her. Smash. The main door to the house below splintered. The monster was inside, on the ground floor. Scrape scrape. The creature from the third door hit the wall outside the fifth room. That I looked wildly around the room. The metal cot, the leather strap. The architect had prepared this as a place of final containment. That I threw the straight razor onto the floor. Instead, I grabbed the thick leather strap from the trolley. That I lunged forward, not aiming for her throat, but for her hands. She was still ringing the bell with that terrible, placid smile. That I grabbed her small wrists and pinned them to the cot, wrapping the leather strap tightly around her hands and the metal frame. The bell dropped from her grasp, hitting the concrete floor with a final, muffled clunk. The winding noise stopped. The bell ringing ceased. The coordinated attack outside the door faltered. The scraping stopped. The heavy footsteps paused. Silence returned to the hallway, but it was heavy, filled with panting and confused shuffling. The woman struggled slightly, her dark eyes still vacant. The true final subject, the one who initiates the chaos. That I backed away from the cot, my own breathing ragged. I had contained the final subject, stopping the noise. The calm voice returned, whispering from the recesses of the room, near the ceiling. The architect congratulates you, Ethan. You have secured the mechanism. But the house requires one final exchange. The key must be used where the spiral ends. I looked down at the silver key in my hand. Where did the spiral end? I looked back at the painting on the wall. The spiral symbol above the woman. The noise. That I looked at the locked door of the fifth room. The only way out was back into the Hall of Horrors. The absolute stillness in the house was now terrifyingly fragile. I stood in the small, makeshift hospital room, facing the strapped-down woman who was the noise. She watched me with those large, vacant eyes, her breathing the only sound in the room. The voice of the architect, calm and pervasive, echoed again. The key must be used where the spiral ends. Where did the spiral end? It was the key to understanding the entire house. I looked back at the painting on the wall, specifically at the symbols and labels. The spiral was labeled the noise, which was the woman, the center of the chaos. The spiral, which I now knew was a recurring symbol of the architect's entire mechanism, started in the quiet master bedroom and unwound through the distractions. The end, the center, had to be the source of the house's energy. That I looked at the silver key in my hand. It was the last skeleton key. It must open the final, hidden door. That I turned my attention to the concrete floor. I dropped to my knees and examined the surface near the cot. The floor was rough and cracked, but just beneath the cot, there was a seam, a perfectly cut square of concrete, almost invisible in the dim light. That I ran my fingers over the seam until I found a slight indentation, just wide enough for the silver key. That I inserted the key and turned it. The tumbler clicked, and with a low, hydraulic switch, the square of concrete lifted a few inches. Beneath the concrete was a small, lead-lined compartment. I lifted the concrete panel fully, revealing the contents, a single, black, worn audio cassette tape. That I pulled the tape out. The label was written in a familiar, elegant script, Final Recording, 124, Hemlock Lane. As soon as my fingers closed around the tape, the voice of the architect intensified, no longer a whisper, but a clear, resonant tone filling the room. Excellent, Ethan. You have found the heart. The final subject is subdued, and the distractions are temporarily confused. Listen to the truth. Understand your legacy. I fumbled with the tape, looking around wildly for a cassette player. There wasn't one in the room. But embedded into the wall, directly next to the fluorescent light switch, was a small, dusty tape deck, the kind used for recording interviews or dictation. That I walked over, inserted the cassette tape, and pressed the play button. The machine whirred for a moment, then played a sound, a low, static hiss, identical to the sound I had heard in the fourth door, the humidifier closet. Then, a man's voice, smooth, deep, and measured, the voice of the architect, began to speak. "My name is Dr. Julian Kroll. I call this house my greatest achievement. The Hemlock Spiral. For too long, the fear industry has relied on crude methods, ghosts, shadows, simple decay. But true horror is structural. It is psychological design." The voice paused, and the background noise intensified, a faint, choked, wet breathing. The breathing of the monster in the basement. The house is built around the subjects. Elias was simple containment, a body to seal the lower levels. Victoria, the liquid entity, was built into the pressurized plumbing. Harold and Josephine, the red entity and the black fluid, were chemical and psychological products designed to seek the source of panic. My mind raced, connecting the terrifying dots. The entities were not ghosts, they were manufactured horrors, products of the house itself. The system requires a constant source of fear to maintain its stability. That source is the noise. The subject on the cot is kept in a state of perpetual panic, which she broadcasts via the silver bell. This broadcast of fear is what attracts and controls the others. The house, Ethan, is a containment mechanism, and you, the fifth subject on my list, are the key to its survival. The previous 4 occupants failed to understand the nature of the trade. They either tried to run or tried to destroy the subjects. They lost their minds, and subsequently, their bodies became materials for the system. The voice became a direct, chilling address. You, Ethan, have been precise. You contained the noise and you collected the catalog. You know the secrets. You have earned your survival. Here is your final instruction, your role in the Hemlock Spiral. The final subject is not the woman on the cot. It is the fifth subject, it is you. The system requires a replacement to maintain the fear. The woman must be contained, but you must take her place. I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. He wasn't offering escape, he was offering a role in his endless, monstrous machine. Open the door to the hallway. Outside, there is a large, black industrial wheelbarrow. It was left by my last failed subject. Use it to transport the woman's body out of the room. Take her to the master bedroom, where the spiral begins. She is now the distraction. You will then return here, to the 5th room, and place this recording into the tape deck, sealing the room behind you. The system will activate. You will become the new source of fear. The final subject. The voice changed, now sounding genuinely pleading. Do this, Ethan, and the house will be stable. You will live forever, contained, but safe from the house's distractions. Otherwise, the noise will return, and they will tear you apart. The tape ended with a sharp click of the machine stopping that I was trembling, staring at the small tape deck. A horrific choice, sacrifice myself to stabilize his twisted system, or be torn apart by the entities I had inadvertently activated. That I looked at the woman on the cot, still restrained, still silent. I had a third option. I could destroy the system. That I pulled the cassette tape from the machine. I had to get out of the room and destroy the tape. If I could destroy the heart of the spiral, maybe I could stop the house forever. That I shoved the tape into my pocket and grabbed the only weapon left, the pearl-handled straight razor. That I unlocked the 5th door and stepped out into the chaotic hallway, ready to run. The hallway was empty, but the sounds were closing in. The scraping from the creature in the 3rd door was now right outside the 2nd door. The wet, heavy footsteps were getting closer to the top of the main staircase. That I had to get to the main door and escape. That I ran past the 3rd door, trying to ignore the sticky, metallic scent of the red fluid. That I got to the top of the main stairwell. The steps leading down into the pitch black of the ground floor looked like a long fall into an abyss. That I took a deep breath and plunged down the stairs. I plunged down the main stairwell, the heavy notebooks in my pockets pulling me off balance. The darkness downstairs was absolute, thick enough to be physical. My foot landed on the bottom step, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. The sound of my arrival acted like a sonic beacon. The heavy, wet thumping that had been approaching from the living room stopped. I knew the basement monster, the one designed to mask the scraping and hunt by sound, was now within feet of me, waiting in the blackness that I killed my flashlight. I had to rely on my ears that I heard the slow, deliberate sniffing begin immediately. It was sweeping the air, searching for my scent that I pressed myself flat against the cold wall next to the stairwell, trying to slow my ragged breathing. The air here was heavy with dust, mold, and that deep, pervasive metallic stench. Sniff. Sniff. The monster was close enough that I could hear the wet, sucking sound of its mucus-clogged nose. Then, from the hallway above me, I heard a different sound, a rapid, low, rhythmic clicking. It wasn't the monster. It was the creature from the third door, the agile one that left the thin, oily tracks. It was moving down the stairs, its metallic clicking feet searching the darkness that I was trapped between two active, lethal entities that I felt a slight vibration beneath my feet. The floorboards were shaking faintly, indicating the basement monster was moving slowly toward my position that I had to distract them both. I reached into my pocket, pulled out one of the heavy, leather-bound notebooks from the catalog, and hurled it hard towards the living room, opposite the direction of the sniffing. Slap. Thud. The notebook hit a wall and fell to the floor. The monster reacted immediately. It let out a confused, rattling roar and lumbered toward the sound, its heavy footsteps shaking the entire ground floor. It was drawn to the noise, away from me. Upstairs, the clicking creature paused its descent, trying to process the sudden, violent distraction that I broke cover and ran. My goal was the front door, which the architect's recording had confirmed was broken. I sprinted across the main foyer, dodging invisible obstacles, guided only by the faint light filtering in from the busted entryway. I could hear the basement monster thrashing through the furniture in the living room, destroying everything in its path. I reached the front door. The wood was splintered around the frame, making it look like a gaping, jagged mouth. I threw myself against it. It didn't budge. The architect had said it was broken, but it wasn't open. The door was still latched from the inside, pinned tight by a heavy iron security bar. I fumbled with the bar, my hands slick with sweat and grime. It was rusted, and the mechanism was stiff. I yanked hard. Crach. The sound of metal on metal was deafening. Upstairs, the clicking creature immediately resumed its descent, moving faster now. The basement monster, realizing the sound wasn't coming from the living room, stopped its rampage. I heard its heavy, focused footsteps turn and begin to approach the foyer. I put my entire weight into the security bar. It bent slightly, but wouldn't release. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the only weapon I had left, the pearl-handled straight razor. I wasn't going to cut the metal, I was going to use it as a tool. I wedged the thin, sharp edge of the blade between the rust-caked bar and the door frame, using the handle as leverage. I pushed down, hard. Snap, the fragile pearl handle splintered, but the leverage was enough. The rusted bar released its grip with a violent clang that echoed through the entire house. I didn't wait. I shoved the door open and burst out onto the massive, overgrown front porch, gulping down the cool, fresh evening air. I was free. I turned back to look at the house, my lungs burning. I saw the shadow of the monster, hunched and hulking, appear in the gaping maw of the front door, but it didn't step onto the porch. It stopped precisely at the threshold, letting out a frustrated, rattling roar. The house was its boundary. Then, the clicking creature from the stairs appeared, smaller and thinner, but its eyes, two horizontal slits reflecting the porch light, were fixed on me. It also stopped at the threshold. I had escaped the confines of the hemlock spiral. I stumbled down the porch steps and onto the overgrown lawn. I was halfway to my car when I stopped. I reached into my other pocket. I pulled out the black audio cassette tape, the heart of the architect's system. If I left the tape intact, someone else would inevitably find this house. Or maybe the system would simply reset and continue its madness. I had to destroy the recording. I knelt down on the damp grass and slammed the tape against a large landscaping stone. The plastic case cracked, but the fragile magnetic tape reel remained intact. It wouldn't break easily. I looked at the house. The monster still stood in the doorway, paralyzed at the threshold. The clicking creature waited. I pulled the pearl-handled straight razor from my pocket. The blade was still gleaming. I used the sharp edge of the razor to slice into the plastic cassette case. I tore the thin magnetic tape free and began to pull it out, wrapping the tape around my hand, breaking the magnetic strip into smaller, ruined lengths. As the tape was destroyed, the house reacted, the monster in the doorway began to shake violently, its heavy breathing turning into a series of panicked, rapid gasps. The clicking creature let out a high-pitched, thin shriek of pain. The energy of the system was collapsing. I stood there, surrounded by the ruined tape, and watched as the lights inside the house, the single fluorescent bulb from the fifth room, the faint hallway lights, flickered and died. The house went completely dark, the monster in the doorway slumped to the floor, motionless. The clicking creature remained still, frozen in the door frame. The hemlock spiral was silenced. I finally turned and walked toward my car, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. I was 5 steps away when I heard it. It wasn't a roar or a wail. It was the calm, clear voice of the architect, somehow louder than it had ever been, seeming to come from the very air around me. You were right to destroy the heart, Ethan. But a structure so carefully built does not fall to silence. You contained the chaos. But you forgot the true source of fear. I froze, turning back to the house. It was a silent, black silhouette against the evening sky. The architect never leaves an empty room, Ethan. And the final subject is always the one who walks away. My car keys were in my hand. I stared at the dark house. The silence was unnerving. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was 10 miles down the road. I knew I was safe. I had destroyed the tape, and the house was inert. I finally reached down to wipe the sweat and grime from my forehead. As my hand passed my eye, I caught my reflection in the side mirror. My eyes, they were large, bulging, and completely white. Like eggs, and on my jacket, where the notebooks had been, I saw the residue, a faint, dark powder, shaped like a beautiful, 3-turn spiral. I wasn't the victor. I was the last contained element. The final subject. I drove. I didn't stop until the sun rose, painting the eastern sky in a nauseating blend of orange and sickly yellow. I was hundreds of miles from Blackwood Creek, sitting in a gas station parking lot, the engine of my car still idling. The moment I saw the reflection of my eyes, the complete, unnerving whiteness, I knew the architect hadn't just defeated me, he had converted me. I was the new containment. I pulled down the visor mirror and stared. My eyes were normal now, brown and bloodshot from lack of sleep. But the memory was intensely real. I looked at my jacket. The dark, spiral-shaped powder residue was gone. It was just trauma, I desperately told myself. Sleep deprivation. A psychotic break from the sheer horror of the hemlock spiral. I needed to establish contact, seek help, but I couldn't. I was a witness to multiple murders, now implicated in the elaborate containment of a horrifying asylum masquerading as a house. I reached for my phone, but stopped. I couldn't risk revealing the house. The police, the investigation, it would only lead them back to Blackwood Creek, perhaps resetting the whole terrifying mechanism. I drove to a remote motel, paid cash, and locked myself in the room. The first thing I did was check my pockets. The weight of the catalog, the 50 leather-bound notebooks, was still there. I pulled them out and spread them across the motel bed. This wasn't just a record of the house's construction, it was the architect's magnum opus, his entire philosophy of manufactured horror. I started reading, searching for the final answer, the final protection. I found it in the very last entry of the very last book. It was not a blueprint for escape, but a chilling realization. Final entry, subject, Ethan, the fifth element. The spiral must continue. The containment of the subject's psyche is achieved not through force, but through isolation and belief. The subject must believe he has won. The moment he looks away, he carries the system with him. The house does not move. The fear does. The architect knew I would destroy the tape. He knew I would walk away. That was the final, devastating step in my induction. I looked at the window. The world outside looked dull, flat, and profoundly uninteresting. The chaos and focus of 124, Hemlock Lane had fundamentally changed my perception of reality that I spent the next 3 days in the motel room, unable to eat, unable to sleep. The notebooks were all I consumed. I memorized the details of the hiss, the clicking, the liquid entity. I was now the guardian of the secrets. On the fourth morning, I woke up with a profound sense of purpose. The architect's voice wasn't speaking, but his logic was guiding me. The house was empty now. The distractions were inert. But the house required a steward. It required preparation for the next occupant that I checked out of the motel. I couldn't go home. I couldn't go back to my old life. That I drove back to Blackwood Creek. When I arrived at 124, Hemlock Lane, it was just as I had left it. The front door was a jagged wreck. The monster was gone. The clicking entity was gone. There was no sign of the red fluid or the black oil. The entire system had reset itself. The house looked strangely clean, purged of the recent chaos that I walked inside. The furniture was smashed downstairs, but upstairs, the hallway was strangely pristine. The only signs of violence were the splinters of wood around the doorframes. That I went straight to the fifth room. The woman, the noise, was gone. The leather strap lay discarded on the cot. That I went to the master bedroom. The music box was still sealed in the steel window panel. I didn't touch it. That I knew my purpose. I was the new architect. I had to stabilize the house. That I retrieved the key ring Mrs. Harlow had given me, the keys to the 7 doors. I needed to seal them again, but first, I needed to make the offering. That I found the industrial black wheelbarrow mentioned in the final recording, tucked away in the overgrown shed. I brought it inside and began the laborious process of cleaning the house. I used the wheelbarrow to haul out the smashed furniture and the lingering organic remnants of the distractions. When the house was spotless and sterile, I started on the doors. I respiked the 3rd door and the 2nd door. I sealed the 4th door. That I went to the master bedroom. I retrieved the music box, careful not to play it. I placed it exactly where I first found it, on the leather armchair, ready for the next discovery. That I then sealed the master bedroom door, nailing in the iron spikes, the familiar metallic ring a comforting sound. Finally, I went to the 5th room, the one where the final subject was contained. I left the silver key, the key to the heart, hanging in the lock. That my final act was the hardest. I pulled out the 50 notebooks, the priceless catalog, and placed them into the black safe in the bunker, locking them away beneath the floor. That I was left with a single, crucial task, the listing. That I found the number for Mrs. Harlow in the old desk. I called her. Her voice, when she answered, was the same dry, monotone rattle of dead leaves. Mrs. Harlow, it's Ethan. Regarding 124, Hemlock Lane. The house is clean. The contents have been addressed. I'm ready to sell. Excellent, Mr. Kroll, she replied, her voice absolutely unchanging. It's Ethan, I corrected her automatically. Of course, Mr. Ethan. And the price? I took a deep, steadying breath. I knew the rule of the spiral. The house had to be irresistible. Listed for half the market value. Cash offer only. No interior photos. Sold as is and where is. And Mrs. Harlow, I added, the familiar, chilling loop of the architect's words coming naturally to my lips, you'll need to sign a waiver regarding any potential contents. She chuckled, a dry, papery sound. Of course. And the contact number for the next occupant? I gave her the new number I had bought, a disposable phone number, my own